All right, so it's our last Vespers of the year, and I hope you guys have enjoyed our journey through Exodus together. I know I have, and I've learned a lot, and the Lord's taught me a lot through this, so I am excited to give you guys an opportunity in a few minutes to share what the Lord has taught you through this study. We're going to open up the mic, but first I want to wrap up the last few chapters in our reading plan and kind of tie a bow before we get some time to share. So we've been going through the book of Exodus and learning about how God freed his people from Egypt and then for worship. And so we got to learn about Moses, right? This guy who didn't feel adequate to take on such a big mission in delivering God's people from Egypt, but God said he would be with him. And so God used Moses to deliver his people. He parted the sea, which is an awesome miracle that we sang about, and then got them into the wilderness. And we see them doubt God's goodness over and over again, but how God still provides for them over and over again. And then we got the 10 Commandments, the law that God gave his people to help them live in the way that they're designed to live. And then we learned about the tabernacle, God's plan to dwell with his people, but then how quickly his people become distracted and take things into their own hands and elevate things or people over God. And then we come to chapter 35, and God did not give up on his people. And even though they got distracted with idols, he's still going to be with them in the wilderness. So chapter 35, I want to point out a few things. First being the fact that Moses starts by reminding his people of the Sabbath. So these last chapters are about God's people taking what God said seriously about building the tabernacle and all coming together and doing their part to build the tabernacle, the place where God would dwell. But before that happens, before they all come together and work in this mission that God has called them to do, Moses says to assemble all the congregation of the people of Israel, and he said to them, "These are the things that the Lord has commanded you to do. 6 days' work shall be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire in all your dwelling places on the Sabbath day." And so what Moses is reminding them here is that you are going to be part of God's work. He's going to use you to build the tabernacle, but God cares about rest. The people that you were just working for in Egypt, they wanted to get everything out of you. They didn't care if you rested. They didn't care about your well-being, but I care about you resting in me, and that's what God wants his people to remember. So even though they're about to be a part of his work here on earth, rest is so important. And I want to encourage us with that we can get so caught up in doing what God's called us to do, which is a really good thing, but we don't prioritize rest. And that is something that we are called to do, to rest in God's goodness and stop working and just be in his presence. And so as you enter into the summer, I hope that you can find some time to rest and just be in God's presence on a consistent basis. So I wanted to point that out. I think that's pretty cool. And then let's skip over to chapter 40. So the very last chapter of Exodus. Over and over again in this chapter, you'll read that the people did as the Lord commanded Moses. And so the people are finally being obedient to what God has asked them to do. And they're going to get off track. They're going to continue to be stiff-necked, but they're finally taking serious this command of what God has asked them to do and to build this place for God's dwelling place. But starting in verse 21, from then on through the rest of the chapter, you see it repeated over and over again, as the Lord had commanded Moses. As the Lord had commanded Moses, as he's talking about putting the tabernacle together, as the Lord had commanded Moses. And I'd challenge you to go through there and highlight it every time. something really cool I learned this week is that there is 6 times that it says this. And then at the very end, in verse 33, it says, "So Moses finished the work." And so that should draw our attention that this is another creation narrative happening, right? Thinking back to the garden, there was 6 days that God created. And then on the 7th day, he said it was good and he rested. And so God is creating again through his people. And then Moses gets to be part of that and the work is finished. And in verse 34, we read basically that God says it's good. He says, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it. And the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and the fire was on it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys." And so what this is saying is that now God has come to dwell with his people, and his people are going in the places that God commands them to go as they continue to wander in the wilderness, but they get to dwell with God because he's come and entered into the tabernacle. And what I want us to hear from this is that God had a plan for these people all along, right? God knew where this story was going. He knew he was coming to dwell with his people, and God has a plan for all of us. And like Trey talked about, we are all little tabernacles now wandering around in the wilderness, but God is with you, and God has a plan for your story, and he cares about your story. Every detail about it. God is with us, and so I want to open up some time for us to share. We have the question on the screen so that you can be thinking about it. But what is an Egypt that God has delivered you from? And how has he sustained you and preserved you through grace? So how has God delivered you? How have you seen God work in your life in a specific situation or season to deliver you? And I just think this is such a cool time to encourage each other and to bring glory to the Lord and sharing little parts of our testimony about how God has delivered us. Because I think if we're being honest, we can see our stories in these people, right? And some of you might still be feeling like you're in Egypt and that you are stuck and you're a slave to something. And I hope that hearing other people's stories of deliverance can encourage you that God has a plan for you and that there is hope for your story.